Thanks everybody for coming here. Like Megan, I was going to try to give a quick rundown of my entire PhD to date. And then sort of late in the game, I decided, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to focus on one specific development that has occurred since my confirmation of candidature a few months ago. But before we get into that, I just wanted to acknowledge that we're on Yugambeh country and that this is stolen Aboriginal land and that sovereignty was never ceded, and that this is just one of many examples supporting Proudhon's famous dictum that property is theft. Okay, so I have two research questions, and this is one of them. To what extent do young people understand and respond to the perceived tension between education for employment and citizenship education? And prior to my COC, that phrase, perceived tension, it used to say conflict. But the COC panel, they argued, they said, well, you know, these two purposes of education don't necessarily have to be in conflict. And I think they're right, and I agreed. So I changed the language to soften the relationship between those two to perceive tension. However, and this is where the development has come in, there is a very real conflict associated with this question. I'll explain it in the next several slides. But first, let's look at why these two purposes of education should be in tension at all. So consider first that by definition, an employee, according, I think, ironically, to the Australian government's Fair Work Ombudsman, is one who, quote, performs work under the direction and control of their employer on an ongoing basis. Now compare that to the well, not a definition, but a key characteristic of what the Australian National Educational Policy document describes as active and informed citizens. These are people who, they say, quote, work for the common good, in particular, sustaining and improving both natural and social environments. So I contend that these are two radically different conceptions of work, and that education and preparation for one tends to occur at the expense of the other. Nevertheless, it's conceivable, as the COC panel pointed out, that it's possible for education to successfully prepare young people for both simultaneously. Now, I have to just take a step back for a second and tell you that in practice, as a high school teacher, it has almost always seemed abundantly clear to me, at least in my experience, that the first of these purposes of education is what predominates, at least in my experience. And you may like to reflect on your own experience in school and see which your education, how it better prepared you for one or the other of these. But indeed, over the last 45 years or so, so roughly under neoliberalism from the 1970s, education for employment has become increasingly predominant. But how do we know that, and what effect has that had on education? I'll address the second of those questions first. So this is a graph of the labor underutilization of young Australians. So young Australians are those from the age of 15 to 24. And labor underutilization is both the unemployment rate plus the underemployment rate together, okay? So the underemployed are those who have work, but they want more and they can't find it, okay? So that's really important because when the ABS sends out these work surveys, they ask, have you done, being paid to do at least 1 hour's work in the last week? And if you answer yes, then you're employed. Well, that's not very useful because most of us can't survive on 1 hour's wage of work. We need more than that. So when we talk about unemployment, this is really the metric that's relevant. It's the two of them together. And as you can see from the graph, as long back as the data has been collected, which roughly starts at the beginning of the neoliberal period, young Australians have become increasingly underutilized. It sort of goes up and down, but now we're at about like 1 in 5, so a little bit more is the most recent data. 1 in 5, approximately, young Australians either has no job or they have a job and they want more, but they can't find it. Okay, so this appears to provide a rationale for bending the purpose of education towards education for employment. After all, if labor underutilization is going up and up, education ought to be increasingly geared towards preparing for it, right? Well, not really. And this leaves unscrutinized the nature of employment and unemployment, which I'll come back to in a moment. But what effect has this labor underutilization had on education in Australia? Let's take a look at the 2 Carmel reports and compare them. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Carmel reports were the first significant intervention by the Commonwealth government in Australia to intervene in schooling in a comprehensive way, rather than responding in an ad hoc manner to specific demands. And the first of them was published in 1973, which was toward the end, but still firmly in the full employment era. So just so you know, every developed country pursued a full employment policy successfully from the end of World War II until the beginning of neoliberalism, which was in roughly the 1970s. End of 1975 was the first time that Australia's unemployment rate rose above 2%. And as far as I'm aware, it's never gone below that since. Okay, so and during that time, during the full employment era, this, of course, included the 1960s, which were a time of great social progress, civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and of course the radical student movements as well, especially in 1968 with the worldwide eruption of student protests in that year. And during that time, again, this was the first one was published in 1973. On the purpose of school, Carmel wrote that schools can build within themselves a community where both education and people are valued, and where the influences of the marketplace do not dictate the price placed upon individual talents. Okay, that was in the full employment era. Now compare that to the Carmel report published 12 years later in 1985, when neoliberalism was getting into full swing and underemployment were rising, just as we saw. Now, on the purpose of education, Carmel wrote that the Australian government wished for, quote, an improved relationship between secondary education and employment and tertiary education opportunities and requirements. And the report goes on to say that it, quote, does not believe that the sole purpose of education is to fashion the young to the needs of the labor market, nor does it believe that this is the government's intention. But it went on to say, quote, employment immediately after schooling or after further study is an expectation for the great majority of people. And then a little further on, to reaffirm the subordination that young people as future employees were expected to incur, it went on, I'm still quoting, it said, one set of skills required in this role, meaning as an employee, is that which involves selecting behavior which is appropriate to the workplace, when and how to accept authority, how to comply with directions, and how to learn what is expected in different situations tends to be learned by experience and demonstrated in everyday life. Work experience programs and increasing employment of secondary students as part-time workers offer the prospect of spreading understanding of labor market expectations among young people well before they seek to become full-time members of it. And if you read these 2 reports, the whole tenor of the report changes under neoliberalism. The latter of them, this one published in 1985, is infused with economic so-called rationality and concepts and jargon. And as far as I'm aware, this was the beginnings of outcomes-based education, which we're all so familiar with now. As I say, the purpose of school under neoliberalism has increasingly become about labor market preparation. And why shouldn't it be? As we saw, labor market underutilization has been steadily on the rise. So what's the problem? Where's the conflict here? You tell me when I'm at 14 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, great. I'm going to end on this slide. So the conflict arises out of the insights of modern monetary theory, or MMT as it's usually abbreviated. Now, modern monetary theory, I think, is the most exciting development in economic theory in the past couple of decades. There's so much to say about it, but I'm just going to focus on one small part of it that's relevant to what we're talking about here. So MMT describes the political choices that are available to governments if they meet what's called the sovereign currency criteria, and which most governments, by the way, in the world now do, including the Australian government. And so the sovereign currency criteria is basically that the government has a monopoly on the issuance of its own currency, and it has a floating exchange rate. And so MMT demonstrates that governments with sovereign currencies, which include Australia, face no nominal constraints on spending. Okay, now that doesn't mean, well, speaking the positive, they do face real constraints having to do with the availability of resources and so on, but they face no nominal spending constraints. Okay, and so what that means is they can always afford to buy anything for sale in their own currency, including, and this is important, including labor. Okay, so in other words, unemployment is a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. Despite, I can see Kate that's like, wow, it's so important. It's huge. It's so exciting. Let me just, I'll go on. So I'll say that again. So unemployment is a political choice. It's not an economic necessity. Despite all the neoliberal dogma that we're fed all the time, it's a political choice. And the reason why MMT is so dangerous to those in power and so exciting for everybody else, at least I think, is that because it lays bare what's politically possible. And at the same time, it exposes the various deceptions that define neoliberal ideology. So for example, we need to privatize this, that, or the other public utility. The Liberal government was going after the post office last time I checked. We need to privatize those things so we can pay for this, or to make them more efficient. And to come back to the point that we're also told that unemployment is a normal, or a quote, a natural phenomenon, which is just crazy. There's nothing natural about unemployment. And to hammer home the point, so the neoliberal dogma goes, because unemployment is natural, well, therefore education must increasingly be about, conferring employability skills and job readiness and those sorts of things. That's bollocks. All of these things are political choices. As I say, they're not economic necessities. And the same goes with universities, which are also increasingly geared towards job preparation. So the university's exclusion from JobKeeper was, like anything else, was a political choice. They could have been included if the government had wanted them to, but of course they didn't want them to. So all of this, it seems to me, is just part of a broader form of neoliberal class warfare meant to discipline working people and students, including academics. What the government could have done, they could have said, okay, guys, we know that you're suffering financially because of the withdrawal from all of the international students and all of their money. What we're going to do is we're going to make up the difference, and you're all going to have to take on greater research profiles in order to make up the difference. They could have done that. I'm not necessarily saying they should have, but they could have done that. They didn't. Okay, so I want to end with a thought experiment. And most MMT proponents, including myself, support what's called a job guarantee. Okay, so I'd like you to imagine, what would education look like if upon completion, every graduate were guaranteed a job democratically created at a living wage, doing meaningful work? And I don't know how much time we've got, but maybe we can just allow. Oh, okay, that's too long, but I went quicker than.
small question there.
Okay, yeah, sure. But I did want to just allow that to sink in and allow everyone to really think about that, because that's a question that I have been thinking about for, I don't know, at least the last 6 months now. So, but yeah, it would be good to ponder it for a moment. Those are my references. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks, comrade. I'm with you there, and I mean, like, when you think about it, they define 1 hour of work, you're not unemployed. So what is the true level of unemployment in Australia? They can say we're fully employed at the moment when most of us are working 10 hours or 15 hours or even 1 hour a week. Yeah, what a joke. Anyway, that's my rant. You can see my bed. Anyway, Jubilee will agree with me. All right, any questions for Jason? Yes, Katie.
I don't have a question. I want to talk about that last.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, feel free. Just go for it. Oh, yeah.
Flick back. Oh, we've lost it.
Oh, dear.
That's okay. I can remember. How creative would we be able to be if we weren't constantly preparing students for this imaginary type of workplace? That it would be so exciting to be able to focus on learning for learning's sake rather than for slaves in the system. Sorry, obviously I agree with you, and I think it's really it's an exciting proposition that children could be children, maybe, you know.
That education isn't just preparing them for work.
Yeah, well,
I don't want to hog the mic, but
so can I just intervene just for 1 second before Patrick's question? But I just wanted to say to come back to what I said is like this perceived tension between these two purposes of school. I mean, I got to say, like, since I began this thesis, I'm trying to be like realistic about what I think can actually be achieved. And so I'm trying to not just cling to my ideals too much, and trying to also to join with, other currents in research, because I think that's really important. This aspect about what a job guarantee would mean for education, as far as I can tell, is sort of underexplored or maybe unexplored. And I think it's a way, it's a compromise between these two purposes of school. Maybe we can't have economic democracy or, an anarcho-syndicalist society tomorrow, but we could, this is possible. And there are people who are doing lots of work trying to make this more broadly known, including Bill Mitchell at the University of Newcastle, just down the coast. He's one of the progenitors of modern monetary theory. It's super exciting. I consider it's a compromise, so it's I think would be an important one too. Kate or Patrick?
Absolutely fascinating, Jason. I just wonder, one question that I think might be worth asking is how do we actually move towards the democratic creation of job guarantees so that we can reimagine the education in our classrooms?
Yeah.
So what practical steps can we take?
That's a really good question. And so one of the most important aspects of the job guarantee for me has been its democratic nature, that it can be democratically created. So just to zoom in and try to stay focused on your question. So the really important points are that the federal government has to fund the program, because unlike state governments and local governments, they don't issue the currency. Only the federal government does that. So the federal government has to fund the program, but the implementation has to, or doesn't have to come, but usually the way it's advised or recommended to be created is at the local level. So for example, the local council, like I live in Byron Shire Council. So the Byron Shire Council would put out to the community and say, okay, what jobs do we want done that are not currently being done? Okay, and there's all kinds of things, and generally the job guarantee has to do with care, That's the big watchword. It's about caring about people, caring about the environment, caring about the community. There's not necessarily very big money to be made in that, so private interests don't always fill all of our needs in that way. So if they did that, then they could say, okay, we've got all of these jobs lined up. We want community gardens that need to be better maintained. We want trees planted there and so on. And then the like all of these private companies like TERSA and these so-called unemployment agencies. I don't know how much experience anyone has had with one of these agencies, but many years ago, I thought I wasn't working for a while, so I thought, okay, I'll try it out. I'll go on the dole. It only lasted a couple of months. It was shocking, like just how ineffective and how unhelpful they were. But they don't have to be like that. As I say, provided the funding is there, because remember, there's no limits on funding. The Australian government, like most governments, meets the sovereign currency criteria. And we all know that now because of COVID. Right? They didn't have to raise taxes to come up with the $800 billion they came up with in 2020 to fund JobKeeper. So the public is primed to understand this kind of thing. But that's the idea, is to get them to fund it, get the councils to decide what jobs need to be done, and then turn those private agencies, those so-called employment agencies, into actual job guarantee offices where you walk in there and the council has supplied them. They say, okay, these are what the jobs that need to be done. And then you say, okay, I'm going to do that one. And you walk out and you start the next day, So that's the way it would go. And by the way, Pavlina Cherneva, she's one of I think maybe the foremost proponent of the job guarantee. She has a little book called The Case for the Job Guarantee. I haven't actually put it on my references, but you can find it there and read it. We'll go into more detail. Do we have time for Kate? Yeah.
I'm not really sure how to articulate.
Yeah, just go for it. Yeah.
So I used to homeschool my children, and we were very much in the natural learning. I guess some people call it unschooling.
Yep.
I don't like to use that word.
Yep.
Have you heard much about that? And what do you have you?
I have heard of it. Yep.
So it is about that, where I think there's this confusion between education and learning, and education in school. And in this community, my kids do go to school now, but it was so beautiful because some of these kids have never gone to school. And just to see them evolve naturally, learning what they're interested in, and then finishing their schooling age and just doing what they wanted to do. It's really, it might be something worth looking into.
Yeah, there is I'm not sure this addresses exactly the point, but just to kind of connect to some of the points you touched on. So I guess what I would call like democratic schools or democratic education is something that was really important for me in connecting with like citizenship education, which I guess is a more formalized sort of state-based form of preparing people to contribute to, as they say, work for the common good, in particular sustaining and improving natural and social environments. And in the literature review I did prior to my COC, there was, it wasn't systematic, but I did look a little bit at some democratic schools. And because what I was here's the point that was really important for me was, how do kids who go to democratic schools, or for example, in your case, who have been raised in a natural schooling environment or no school, how do they transition to the workplace? How is it that they go from doing more or less whatever or being leading on their own, and how do they go then to transitioning to the workplace where they have a boss, oh, that's good to know. That's good to know. Is there any research on it
I don't know.
Yeah, so
my daughter started school in year 5 for the first time. And she just fell into it. It took her a few weeks to adjust, and then she was following orders. And
no, but I mean,
the job
the job bit.
I could see where that it would go. And I know friends where the children never went to school, and at 18 they went into the workforce.
So that's for me the really interesting point, is like, how do they?
Not conditioned, but they still,
yeah, I don't know.
Anyway.
Sure. Yeah, let's go. But thanks, everyone.